In this screencast, we're going to discuss a useful tool we call the service path, which helps you test and learn about any DOTS web service. With the service path, you can view all available operations in a service, perform simple one-time lookups, and see how the request and response formats are structured. To follow along with a few of these examples, you will need your license key. Let's begin. First, open a browser and go to trial.serviceobjects.com or ws.serviceobjects.com if you're a current customer. This landing page shows all currently available DOTS web services. For this screencast, we're going to use DOTS Address Validation US Release 2, but you should open the appropriate service for your key. Here we can see the service name, a list of all available operations for this service with descriptions, and a link to the service WSDL, which we'll discuss later. For now, let's take a look at our favorite operation, Validate Address with DPV. Here we see a simple form for the Validate Address with DPV operation. Each field represents a value your application should send to the service. If you're following along, try inputting some test data along with your license key, but note that this will count as a single transaction. When you click Invoke, the page will call our service using the HTTP GET protocol. But before getting too technical, let's just send the address and see what happens. This messy text is exactly what your server sees when it calls our service over HTTP GET. This data format is known as XML, similar to HTML, and while it is somewhat difficult for humans to read, it is extremely readable for computers. But you can see the returned address is located in the address node, the city name in the city node, and so forth. Your application might not use all of these outputs, but with the service path, at least you can see what's available. Before we move on, I mentioned earlier that this was an HTTP GET request. This is just a fancy way of saying that it's a simple URL call. Notice that by changing the URL in the address bar and hitting enter, we get a new response. There are two other ways to call the service called HTTP POST and SOAP, which we'll get into shortly. The form page has other useful information as well. Scrolling below the form, you can see several boxed areas containing more XML. These regions show exactly what the service expects a request to look like, and what the response will look like when using certain protocols. This is useful if you need to manually construct an HTTP request in code, although this is usually handled for you in most platforms, or if you're not sure what object names to use when drilling into the data structure to find the data you're after. Here we see the request and response structures that apply to calls using SOAP 1.1 or SOAP 1.2. Here are the structures that apply to calls using the HTTP GET protocol. Notice the response looks almost the same as what we saw in our browser call. And here we see the structures that apply to calls using HTTP POST. One of the more advanced uses for these request templates is to troubleshoot issues making a successful connection or request to the service. If you want to be absolutely sure your request is formatted properly, you could use an HTTP debugger such as Fiddler, and simply copy and paste the request template for the type of call you're making into the request box with some sample data, and see if the transaction completes successfully. If an error occurs, it's a sure sign that something malformed in your request. You can see that if I deliberately change the request format, the request will not succeed. Finally, you can also use the service path to locate and read the service's WSDL. A WSDL, WSDL or Web Services Description Language, is a very important XML document that tells your application everything it needs to know about the service. In fact, all the pages and forms you've seen so far in the service path were generated using the information in that WSDL. It contains the service name, operation names, request and response structures, data types, and more. But even developers don't typically need to look at the WSDL itself. All that's typically needed is to give the WSDL URL to the development software so the necessary request objects can be generated automatically for the developer to use. That's it! I hope you've seen just how useful the service path can be in helping you test, interact with, and understand the DOTS web services you use. I'm sure if you go on an adventure and try it out on your own, you will find even more ways it can be useful to you and your application. Thanks for listening, and feel free to contact us with any questions or comments you might have.